Hi there, I'm Jim.
And I'm Claire.
Let's talk teaching. Welcome to Let's Talk Teaching, a podcast from the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Technology here at Illinois State University. I'm Jim G. Joining me today, our director, Dr. Claire LaMonica. Happy New Year, Claire.
Thank you. Happy New Year to you, Jim.
People may be hearing this in February, so that may be a little bit late.
This year is getting pretty old at this point.
You know, we're recording this like...
I'm kind of over this year, actually. Is it
No.
too early?
No, I don't think so at all, because, I mean, I was looking, it's like we're already, the semester's already started when we're recording this. It's around January 18th, I think is the day that we're recording it, and I looked at the calendar like, what happened? We are looking forward to the new year. Even though it seems to be speeding along like a freight train already, because with our new season of podcasts that we're producing, we wanted to revisit, or actually visit kind of in depth for the first time, one of our most looked to, most used books here at CTLT. Tell us about it.
Well, what I'm hoping that we'll do this semester is take a look at a book called How Learning Works, 7 research-based principles for smart teaching.
And of course, here we have another 7. We were talking about this before we started recording. We have another 7 best practices or principles that we're looking at.
Right, because we did, 7 good practices for undergraduate, 7 principles for good practice in undergraduate education. And
Right.
Now we're doing 7 research-based principles for smart teaching. So, yeah, the number 7 seems to come up a lot, but it's supposedly a lucky number, I think. So
I guess so.
Okay. Yeah.
And this book in particular approaches teaching a little bit differently than the previous 7 principles that we were talking about.
Right. Like the other book, or the other one is actually kind of a monograph, but this one is research based. The thing I like about this is it's much more explicit. It doesn't just have sort of a gigantic bibliography at the end, sort of listing all the research they looked at. Mm-hmm. It's much more explicit in terms of identifying and bringing together the research throughout. It has a pretty clear structure. Each chapter is structured in the same way. It was written. It's a collaborative work. It
Mm-hmm.
was written by 5 people kind of working in the field of professional development for faculty. It's very user-friendly. Each chapter takes one principle. It starts with a couple of sort of case studies. This happened in this classroom and this happened in this classroom. What's going on here?
Mm-hmm.
Then it identifies the principle. Then it really pulls that principle apart and looks at the research behind the principle. And then, and I think this is faculty's favorite part, it has, maybe it's just my favorite part, but it has strategies. So how do you apply this principle in your classroom?
Mm-hmm.
What does this mean for your teaching and for
Mm-hmm.
your students' learning? And it's very classroom-friendly sort of ideas, things you can do to activate student learning.
Right, exactly. And so I think it's those strategies that we are helping guide faculty members towards using. So I think probably, and as we kind of talked before we started recording today, it's the strategies that we'll ultimately end up focusing on quite a lot. And there are a lot of different topics, so there's a lot to unpack from this book.
There is a lot to unpack. It's pretty dense. It's very it's very user friendly, not just in terms of the repeated structure, but also very accessible language. You don't have to be an expert in teaching and learning to to read this. It's not loaded with jargon and so on and so forth.
And I think that the topic that we want to talk about today, in particular, the principle we want to focus on, is also kind of a good introductory sort of topic as we kind of dive into this book over the course of the next several episodes and throughout the year, because we're talking about this thing that we've talked about a lot before, which is prior knowledge and assessing students' prior knowledge. And that's something that I think is easy for teachers to wrap their brains around as far as what it is. Getting past some of our own assumptions, as I'm sure we're going to talk about, may not be quite as easy.
Right. So the actual principle is, principle number 1, students' prior knowledge can help or hinder learning. And I think that that's something that anybody who's been in the classroom for a while has sort of figured out. I think you might come into a teaching career thinking, oh, prior knowledge, that's a good thing. If they already know stuff, then, and even assuming that students will know stuff. And then you learn pretty quickly that sometimes it's a bad thing.
So give us an example of that.
Okay. So prior knowledge. So, all right. So I think I've talked before about this thing I used to do to assess students' prior knowledge about writing. Okay. So in a first-year composition course, first day of class, I would give students an assignment, make a list of 10 things you already know about good writing. Okay. Some of those things were really helpful prior knowledge. So when a student said, writing is a painful and messy process, that actually, I liked it when I saw that. Not so much when I saw good writing always has 5 paragraphs.
Right.
That was prior, and that could be very deeply ingrained idea that they really had reinforced over many, many years of writing instruction.
Right.
So, when I saw that, that was not quite as encouraging. Yeah. Little discouraging.
Sure.
But the good thing is that then I knew that was out there.
Right.
Because I had strategies for addressing that. Or that misconception. So I just needed to know that I needed to implement them.
So even uncovering the kind of prior knowledge that hinders their learning or could potentially hinder their learning from a teaching standpoint, that empowers us to do something about it.
Right. That means once I know that they're thinking that, without having to wait till I get their first paper and see, oh, it has 5 paragraphs. Did they do that on purpose, or did they just happen to have 5 paragraphs worth of stuff to say, or, whatever. So, yeah.
So my introduction into this idea of prior knowledge was, when I first started teaching on the university level, I was a practitioner who was brought in, as a professional from an industry that was brought in to teach. And I had no idea what I was doing, and no one really seemed to care about that. They just kind of let me go, and good luck. Yeah. And so I did that. And what I discovered was the first assessment I would give, the first big test I would give, they did awfully.
Yeah, they would bomb.
They would bomb on it. So I kind of came to prior knowledge from kind of backwards originally. I wasn't assessing their prior knowledge, but I realized suddenly that there was something that was affecting their ability to do well on this test. Now, there are probably a lot of factors there, including how the test was designed and all that other stuff, which is, as we like to say...
Really?
Yeah, right. Which is, as we like to say, another episode. Yeah. But what I realized was that it was also an issue of prior knowledge. I was assuming that they knew things about, in this case, journalism or broadcast journalism, or even just how the world worked, that was confounding them. So let's kind of transition into some of the strategies we want to talk about. How do we actually know that we're doing a good job assessing their prior knowledge?
Okay, so I think before we even do that, we want to sort of back up a little bit.
Okay,
I'm going to back up, and I want to talk for just a minute. Yeah, beep, beep. Very nice. That's actually a pretty good imitation.
We've added sound effect. Yeah, I'm turning into the Mel Blanc of podcasting.
I want to talk a little bit about when prior knowledge does help. And when it doesn't help, because the research has actually uncovered specific circumstances under which prior knowledge is helpful or when it's not.
Okay.
So prior knowledge is helpful when students have activated it, so they're actually using it. Okay. There might be stuff in their heads that they know, but they're just not drawing on it. That happens all the time, by the way.
Yeah.
A whole lot.
Yeah.
And we say, they were supposed to learn this in that prior class. Well, yeah, maybe they did, but they don't, they haven't figured out that they need to use it in this class. When it's sufficient, so that means they need to know enough, all right, to move on to whatever it is that you're asking them to move on to. When it's appropriate, So some things we know might be appropriate in some situations, but not others.
Mm-hmm.
But because we know it, we think, oh, well, I need to apply that in every situation I encounter.
Oh, yes,
But,
yes.
it's not everything we know is applicable to every situation.
Uh-huh.
So it's like I used to say, raising 3 kids, the only thing I learned was that nothing I learned raising the first one was applicable to the second one, and nothing I learned, from the second one was applicable to the third one.
Well, and to go to back to your original example about the 5-paragraph writing structure, there are times when that may be appropriate, but not in every. It's not a universal rule.
Not generally.
Not generally. Yeah.
And of course, this almost seems like a given, but prior knowledge is only helpful if it's accurate.
Uh-huh.
And so sometimes they've half learned something, or they haven't quite learned something, or they just learned it wrong.
Yeah.
And that means, that's not helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the first times when it's not helpful, is when it's inaccurate.
Right.
Okay. It's also not helpful if they're not calling on it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It's in there, but they're not calling it up. When they don't know enough. Okay. Or
Mm-hmm.
when it's inappropriate. So sort of the flip side of all the times when all the circumstances under which it was appropriate, when it does help learning, it doesn't help learning if those circumstances are reversed.
Sure.
So that's sort of, that's kind of the general overview.
So how do we
How do we act on that?
Yeah, how do we act on that? How do we actually know that we're getting that? How do we know that is what it is?
Right.
How do we assess it?
So how do we implement it?
Yeah.
So it's not
Yeah.
always a matter of assessing. It's just a matter of putting it into practice.
Okay.
And, so using it in our classrooms.
Right.
So and what we basically want to do. So the big thing we want to do is take those kinds of prior knowledge that hinder learning and flip them so that they become the kinds of prior knowledge that help learning.
Okay.
So, for example, when prior knowledge is inactive, that hinders learning.
Mm-hmm.
When it's active, when it's been activated, it helps learning. We want to find ways to activate their prior knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
So we've talked about this before, too. We've talked about what people in education call the anticipatory set, which is something you do. It's other people call it the hook.
Mm-hmm.
It's the thing you do at the start of class that sort of brings them all together and gets their brains in the right place to learn what it is that you want them to learn that day.
Okay.
So you might, for example, do what I did in the writing class. Just have them think about, what do you already know about this topic?
Mm-hmm.
And there's lots of ways to do that. I had them make a list. You can have them do group brainstorming. You can have them do a little free writing. You can have them create a concept map.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of fun. You put the main idea for the day, in the middle, and then say, hey, and they could do that individually, or you could do it collectively as a class.
Sure.
So there's lots of ways to sort of turn inactive prior knowledge into active prior knowledge.
And I think, the one, so going back to my discovery of prior knowledge and whatnot. So the next step I did was not very effective, where I stood up and I said, you know what, you all should already know X, Y, and Z. Who doesn't know it? Raise your hand. Well, that didn't work.
No, of course not, because nobody's going to say they don't know it.
Exactly.
There's hardly ever any pedagogical advantage to excoriating your students.
That's exactly right.
That's
I understood
tip
that
for the day.
Yeah, I understand.
Or publicly shaming or asking them to publicly shame themselves.
You put it very nicely in one of our early podcasts where you said essentially, and I'm paraphrasing here, the stocks went out of style a long time ago.
Something like that. Yeah.
No, and I agree. And so but I think it is something that we, the flip side of that is that we do need to recognize that as we're asking students to think about this, that when they realize that maybe where their prior knowledge lies,
right,
there may be an emotional aspect of that they have to deal with.
Sure, yeah.
So we talked before we began recording. I talked about how I had assumed a lot of prior knowledge based on students' majors, and I didn't realize I had a student in the class who wasn't actually a major in the department. He was taking it as a minor, and so his experiences were different. And he was brave enough to put up his hand and say, "You know what? I actually never talked about that in any classes.
Yeah.
I'd like to learn more."
Yeah.
And I'm like, "Oh, okay, great."
Yeah.
And we can talk at other times about how do you supplement individual students, in that.
Yeah,
regard.
because that's really the most for me, when I look at this list, that's probably the most confounding thing and I think that's what we hear about over and over again from people who say, my student should know this.
Yeah.
They should have learned this in X class. They should have learned this in third grade. And sometimes it's they do know it, it just hasn't been activated.
Right.
So they haven't activated. So that's like, punctuation. They should know to put a period at the end of every sentence. Well, of course they do. They do know that they do, but they didn't realize that you cared.
Yeah.
So, let them know you care. That they need to activate that prior knowledge. But I think this idea of when their prior knowledge is insufficient, that's really confounding to us, partly because that insufficiency may vary from student to student.
Right.
So, some students will actually remember more from a previous course, or they will have learned it better. So, or for whatever reason. So you can have students at different levels. When we were talking earlier, I told the story about the time that I went to teach an upper level, sort of medium level writing class. And I started the class with the assumption that all of my students would have taken courses in which they compiled writing portfolios before. And so I went in ready to sort of hit the ground running. I didn't plan to spend any time talking about, the concept of the writing portfolio, what it was, what my expectations. Buzz, wrong. A whole bunch of them had never even heard of the concept of a writing portfolio. So I had to, that was okay. It was most of them, almost all of them. And so I had to sort of go back and rethink my approach to what I was doing, particularly early in the semester. So, and it was, mostly it was a matter of logistics. Like, don't just save your new drafts over your old drafts, save them as separate, give it a new name, whatever, because you want to be able to see growth and development and blah, blah, blah. That was probably a pretty easy place to be. The harder place to be is when you're assuming that all of your students know how to, know what mean, median, and mode are, and all but 3 of them do. You've got a 20 student class and you've got 3 students who don't know mean, median, and mode. And now, what am I going to do with those 3 students?
And you're right. That is something that we encounter a lot here at CTLT. That's, in the consultations that we do. A future episode that we hope to produce of our humble, pokey little podcast here is about welcoming office hours and doing that. And I think, some of the teachers I've worked with, some of the faculty members I've worked with, where this has come up, they have successfully used strategies like having group office hours and whatnot, where you're not singling out individuals, but you're at least welcoming them, inviting them. You help them realize what they don't know, and then you invite them in outside of the class. Because the other part of it is, I don't want to have to, as horrible as it is to use this phrase, teach to the lowest common denominator.
Right.
I don't want to put the brakes on everything.
Right. You don't want to put the brakes on everything. You don't want to have to use class time for that. This is a situation where if this is something that comes up over and over again, you know that every semester you're going to have those 2 or 3 students who can't remember, don't know what mean, median, mode are. You could create a quick little podcast or video cast. This is mean, median, a video lesson, digital lesson, stick it into ReggieNet, and then tell students, hey, if you can't remember the difference between mean, median, and mode, or if you've never heard of these before, access this lesson, take a little quiz, do whatever, whatever.
Yeah. And there may be something that already exists out there that you could just point them to.
I bet you can just click to a link of Khan Academy.
Well, a good example of that was when I came back to get a graduate degree. One of the first classes I took on rhetoric was the instructor had a little pamphlet that was like, introduction to rhetorical terms. And it talked about Aristotle, and it talked a little bit about, and then it had some other stuff in there too, but and rhetorical criticism a little bit. But it was just a primer because it was a big tent, and we had a lot of students from a lot of different disciplines coming in to actually explore these topics, and that was one way to supplement that. And we could use it or not.
Yeah.
But it was a good reference to have. So even just giving them reference, I think, is sometimes important. So going back to the strategies and whatnot, what other strategies do you think that we should have in our toolbox?
In our toolbox?
Yeah.
So let's see. We talked about some strategies for sort of accessing prior knowledge,
right,
or finding out what students already know or don't know. We might want to spend just a second on activating prior knowledge. So
right,
you're pretty sure they know it, but they're not applying it. So like that whole they're not putting periods at the end of sentences. I mean, that's such a I don't. But it probably happens.
Well, or not putting commas between two independent clauses joined by a conjunction.
Yeah, something like that they know. You can just explicitly set that expectation out there.
Yeah.
So, hey, in this class, I expect you to, abide by the, the conventions of written, written communication. And if you need a review, here's a link to the Purdue online writing laboratory,
sure,
whatever. So, or you can ask questions that require them to use prior knowledge. So, think about protagonist. You could say, okay, so let's think about some protagonists. Who were the protagonists in some? Who was the protagonist in your favorite book?
So when we're talking about applying prior knowledge or activating, we're talking about activating prior knowledge. One way to achieve that seems to be to apply it to the real world, or to
make a connection,
to make those connections. That seems to be probably one of the best paths to take.
Yeah. My 5-year-old grandson is in kindergarten, and he recently learned that a period means stop. It's a stop sign.
It's a stop sign.
Yeah. And so, now once we can get him past saying stop every time he encounters a period, we're going to be in great shape. But
Alas,
that real world analogy, even at 5, he knows that a stop sign means stop.
Right.
And so that teacher's analogy between the period and the stop sign, that was helpful. That it struck a chord.
Yeah.
It linked a new concept to something he already knew.
Right.
And now he's sort of over applying that, but and he's probably past that by now. But it was kind of a cute thing that he did.
And it's a shame we no longer send telegrams to each other, because that could have been he could have been the chosen one in terms of that. So what else do we need to know?
I think probably another hard thing is correcting inaccurate prior knowledge. So that's something, I said, well, when a student comes in and says all good writing has, 5 paragraphs, well, that's a pretty easy fix, because I can say, hey, I can say, go out and find me something published,
right?
Or look at these, these are models of the kinds of things we're going to write in this class. Do these models, in fact, follow that format? Do they conform to that convention, which is, tell them what you're going to tell them 3 things, tell them the 3 things you told them. One of my children once called that the world's most boring way of writing. But the thing is that there are very few, if any, models of that in good. You couldn't go to an anthology of essays and find a 5-paragraph theme. There's just no way, So you can't even go to, I was going to say Time Magazine, but you can't really practically go to Time Magazine anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, you can go to Time Magazine either online or in print, but there just aren't many places you can go where you're going to find that format.
Yeah,
it's
that's
not
true.
something that gets used in the real world. That's a way to sort of, so you can start by undermining that. If it's a math class or a science class, and they say, oh, of course, these two things have different speeds or whatever. And you're like, yeah, okay. So, ask them to justify their reasoning if they tell you something that's wrong, you can say, okay, so tell me more about that. How did you reach that conclusion?
Right.
What kinds of evidence do you have for that?
Right.
And so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So,
because I know the authors talk about helping students to identify the contradictions in their knowledge versus actual knowledge. I think it's a phrase that they use. And then the other thing I remember they advise is that you have to give them multiple opportunities to do that. It's not necessarily just a one-off.
And time.
Yeah.
Ken Bain says mental models change slowly, and
Yeah.
I go back to that so often. It takes time, especially once there's an idea in your head, changing that idea about anything is just, a tortuous process.
Yeah.
It's hard for the teacher. It's hard for the learner. It's slow. It's time consuming. It's frustrating.
Right.
It generates a certain amount of anger.
Yeah.
And angst. So learning is tough.
But it's worth going through, because
Absolutely.
when we're going through this process of dealing with prior knowledge and helping students identify where they're at themselves, then once you go through that process, it's a great feeling as a teacher to be able to say, all right, guys, we got this. We can move on now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're ready.
We're there.
You're there. We've reached this goal. We've reached this plateau. Let's keep going up the mountain, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Claire, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim.
And that's all the time we have for this week's episode of Let's Talk Teaching. You can find out more about the podcast by going to ctlt.illinoisstate.edu and clicking on the podcast link in the upper right of the page. For Dr. Claire LaMonica and for all my colleagues here at the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Technology, until we talk again, happy teaching.